Not moved. We come now to Amendment 70, Lord Fuller.
I wish to speak to Amendment number 70, standing in my name, on the order paper. Now, since the Great Reform Act of 1832, local authorities have been an integral part of our nation. Why? Joseph Chamberlain unleashed the powers of municipal entrepreneurialism in the 1800s, bringing gas and clean water to the growing metropolis of Birmingham. A new council in Stevenage was created for the first new town, complete with a traffic-free zone that was opened by Her Majesty the Queen. And I know that the noble Lady Baroness Taylor has done her bit to shape that town since, and to bring us right up to date. The leader of Cornwall Council, another Taylor, my friend Linda Taylor, who has announced she is stepping down in May, has championed a spaceport in her county. And I congratulate her for those efforts and thank her for her service to the local government family. Now, all these activities are about the 140 things that local authorities do for every family, in every street and in every neighbourhood. And for the last 14 years, I've been Vice Chairman of the Local Government Association Economy and Resources Panel. I led all the district councils of England with Baroness Taylor for our respective parties during COVID, and I remain a councillor. So I know that council finances in England are under pressure like never before. Reductions in grant funding, increases in the scale and complexity of service demand, and the recent spike in inflation and wage costs have created the perfect storm for our town halls. And the fundamental challenge facing the sector is that cost and demand pressures are rising faster than funding. While inflation has fallen steadily since its peak in 2022-23, significant cost and demand pressures remain in the system in council services. And in essence, council revenues tend to grow linearly with the growth in the wider economy, but lately costs have grown geometrically in councils, with demand for homelessness, children's social care, adult social care, home-to-school transport growing fast and likely to get even worse. The COVID overlay, of course, is a further aggravation. So there comes a moment where the lines of income and demand diverge so much that the gap becomes unbridgeable. And that moment was already upon us before the national insurance announcements. And I want to explain the serious and consequential effects. Of the 140 activities undertaken by councils, 3 of them are responsible for nearly 2/3 of all the cost: social care in adults and children and special educational needs. And these pressures have seen the greatest increase in cost. We should get some numbers onto the record for the noble minister. Increases in cost and demand in adult social care have risen by 3.7 billion, that's 18%, in the 5 years since 2019. Spending on children's social care has increased by 25.7% in real terms in the 5 years from 2019 to the current year. Growing numbers of children with educational care and health plans mean that money spent on home-to-school transport has risen by 62.7% in the 5 years to this year. And taken together, the increased demand for services for children with special educational needs and disabilities result in an expected current account deficit of £5 billion this year for these services. Now, the Labour-run LGA tells me that by 2026-27, these cumulative pressures will have increased the cost of delivering services by 12.5% in just the last 2 years, leaving councils facing an annual funding gap of 6.2 billion just to sustain services at 2024 levels. These pressures come on top of the fact that councils have already absorbed a 22% reduction in core spending power from 2010, and that's before Labour pursued its reckless war on the countryside, with cancelling the Rural Services Grant, a 10 million cut in Devon and more in Yorkshire besides. My lords, this can't carry on. But coming back to the big 3, together with the additional costs of addressing homelessness and migration, these issues are dangerously squeezing out all the other activities that should be the core purpose of councils that Chamberlain, Baroness Taylor and the other Taylor in Cornwall would all recognise. To provide the best possible natural and economic environment to grow a business and raise a family, building the national economy one local economy at a time. But the things that are getting squeezed out is planning for growth, keeping the streets clean, teaching the kids to swim in the local baths. Now, to turn to the council pay bill, Many other parts of the public sector, like the police, the judiciary, the military and teachers, have escaped the full impacts of the national minimum wage, which the Library of the other place tells me has increased by over 70% in 9 years. And of course we celebrate this pay rise for Britain. But at the same time, we need to recognise that this policy disproportionately affects local government, where many important supporting or caring roles, even in leisure centres, have historically been lower paid. I've explained the pressures. Now let's look at the pernicious effects of the national insurance levy, which makes all these things worse, which burdens the council taxpayer who has to fund all this out of already taxed income. Let's get to the nub of the matter. The additional burden of national insurance contributions on council's own payroll is estimated to be £637 million for the directly employed staff. But indirect costs, increased through commissions providers, will cost the councils an extra £1.3 billion next year, over and above, so including a further £628 million for adult social care. So, taking the £1.3 billion and the 628, we see a total financial impact of national insurance contributions on councils and their tied contractors of £1.741 billion. And having given warm words to councils that the cost of NIC would be compensated as they would be in the health service, the reality is that just the £515 million has been allocated to the sector. In essence, it has left councils with a £1.226 billion headache over all the other pressures I've laid out. And it's really important that we consider the effect of the tied contractors. These contractors put their shoulders to the wheel. They're looking after the most vulnerable in society. They work exclusively for councils in many cases. They are an extension of the council workforce. They are on the team. But they can't afford to take this one for the team. The Care Provider Alliance estimates that 73% of social care providers will need to refuse or accept new packages of care from councils or the NHS. 64% will need to let staff go. It's a tax on jobs. 76% will need to make cuts to training and resources, and 22% will have no choice but to close down their business. So the increases in national insurance contributions are a sucker punch to organisations that are already not managing, and the impacts will be felt not only in the council's payroll, but those that work in the wider ecosystem hand in hand for support. The people affected are going to be the elderly, just about managing at home, the troubled child who finds it difficult to thrive in big school, and the complicated families with chaotic circumstances. Potentially the worst of all this relates to the worst of all this relates to the promise that there will be no money beyond this year whilst a comprehensive spending review is undertaken. The whole finance system was already wobbling as it picks up the pieces from COVID, but this new NIC pressure comprehensively fails to provide councils with the security of funding they need to reliably and effectively deliver for all their communities. And the lack of commitment on the comprehensive spending review adds further insult to injury. My Lords, we're storing up a huge democratic problem when 2/3 of the budgets are spent on just 4% of the population, when the 96% don't get to see it as the other parts of the state cost shunt onto councils. But, my Lords, it's a fantasy to think also that local government reorganisation, creating those huge remote Orwellian strategic authorities to replace the local-friendly districts, will aggravate the situation even more. Tinkering just to add a few council tax bands won't move the needle. There aren't enough large houses in many areas to support extra tax, and removing a 25% discount for widows, which has been mooted, kicking old dears already clobbered by the winter fuel allowance, will not wash. So my amendment seeks for the government to report on the effects of all of this, and by extension to compensate councils for the actual cost of the increases in national insurance. It need not be difficult. When national government changes the business rate situation, a Section 34 claim under the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act 1996 provides a template to refund these costs to councils. See, there you go. I provided the solution without any more legislative or parliamentary time being needed. My amendment would have the effect that the doorstep services that residents value the most in cathedral cities, coastal communities, market towns, new towns and the countryside up and down our nation can be protected. So I'd like to ask the Minister a number of specific questions. Does he accept that the LGA's figures on the effect of this national insurance contribution charge are correct, not only for direct but also for indirect employment? Does he recognise that £1.227 billion shortfall in aggregate to councils? Why is local government being treated differently in respect of national insurance contributions to national government? What assessment has been made on the most vulnerable? What commitments can he give to the treatment of NICs being remitted back to councils after the comprehensive spending review? And how does allowing councils, as I've heard, to borrow against the shortfall caused by NIC help the Chancellor's golden rules? Now, this amendment is a probing amendment, but it is no less serious for it. On this side, we're laying down a marker which demands a response to yet another broken promise. The noble Lord should know that this tax isn't just a free hit on the man from the council. Can he just admit that the effect is actively targeting the most vulnerable in our society and the people I thought the Labour Party came into existence to protect? I beg to move.
Proposed, after clause 3, insert the following new clause as printed on the marshalled list.